So, new hair. I got this specifically for something that I'm now involved in, which I'm not actually entirely sure when I'm allowed to tell you about it. I'm sure I'll do an announcement video when I can. But perhaps more importantly for these videos, another thing I got for that was an actual microphone. Obviously I've been considering doing that for a while because I'm doing these videos anyway, just to see if it improves the audio at all. This is the first time I'm actually recording with it, so I'll find out what kind of improvement it's done when I watch this back. But yes, also for whatever I'm doing there, got this microphone to help out. Benefits here. So with that, let's just get on with that video. So, hello and welcome to the Ragnarok Chronicles. My name is Dominic and this is the channel where I just take you through some of the stuff relating to the books that I am writing. Or more specifically this video, I'm going to talk about the writing process itself, rather than necessarily the content that comes out of it on my end in turning things into these books. I have done a video already detailing the protagonist of this first series of books, Philip Quint. So if you've seen the word protagonist in this title and also seen the protagonist in that video as well, right back from the very first day of upload at the beginning of August, don't worry, this isn't just a repeat of that video, I wouldn't do that. No, I want to talk about the idea of creating protagonists in general, and more importantly, if you're creating multiple series that are also connected to each other, how do you make sure that each protagonist in each is definitely distinguished one from the other? Now, of course, there are superficial details that you can give that will automatically make them different from each other, just their name, their background, what are their circumstances. But more than just saying, oh, they have this hobby, they are involved in this thing, I'm more worried about how they actually come across as a personality within the stories. I don't know if this is something that other writers come across, but I often find that I risk with my main characters kind of making them react similar to one another, to have the similar attitudes towards the same situations, because even though I usually write in the third person, because there is still a protagonist, they are still the lens through which the reader is experiencing the stories. It's also through whom I am writing, essentially, and so it's often is a matter of instinctively how would I react to that situation, not necessarily them. This isn't an issue that comes up with other characters because, you know, it's just like looking at my friends or other people. I can see that they react and behave differently. I have no issue just saying, oh, this character would do this thing, which I would obviously never do, but obviously they're not me. But no, the protagonist, because they're who is seeing it through who I'm writing, even if all of the other circumstances were different if you were to describe the character, is still a matter of what would I say, what would I do? And obviously if that's what I'm doing for every single protagonist in each sub-series throughout the 55 books in the Ragnarok Chronicles, okay, not that they all have their own individual protagonists, but still plenty, then that's not going to feel very differentiated. And of course, if I would like people to commit to reading all of these stories, obviously each of them have, just as how the characters have their own circumstances, each story has their own plots, their own adventures, their own twists and styles, you also want to make sure that the characters are having that much variety as well. So, what can you do to make sure that your protagonist isn't just a conduit for yourself, at least not entirely? There's no problem having a few similarities here or there. Well, the first important thing is to not fall into the trap of just considering those details you would describe the character as having as just being superficial details. They're not. Each and every one is going to have shaped that person's life experience up until this point. Even if you are setting this in a completely fictitious location with its own history, unless you're really going to justify that everyone has had the exact same kind of experience growing up in that society, there is at the very least going to be some difference in the experience of the person's sex, separately that person's gender, sexuality, their religion, their culture, and again, just the more, what have they gone through already in terms of their general circumstance, who are their parents, what do they do, are they in school, whatever it is. They aren't just things to say, oh, this person did this thing. No, that's going to have shaped them each in some way. Now, just on this point, if you are going to be doing something that's set on Earth where someone is from a particular culture or has some element of their identity which will have specific ramifications upon that life experience, probably best to make sure you do your research in that regard to make sure that you're not just flagrantly assuming what it is like to have that kind of identity if it's not your own. And again, the whole exercise I'm trying to describe here is creating people who aren't you. That's also, in turn, not to say that everyone is going to have the exact same experience, but, you know, just try not to be going along any kind of necessarily stereotypes or anything like that. If you can actually talk to people from those kind of backgrounds or identities, whatever it is, you get their voice in it, or again, just look online, look at other discourse from those people, from those voices, and just try to get an appreciation of the sort of thing. Now, in turn, again, because it's caveat after caveat with me, you do have to be careful in certain cases that, say for instance in my circumstance, as a cis white male, should I necessarily be telling certain life narratives, as it were? Like, should I be the one that's trying to tell these stories as opposed to those actual people themselves? I don't know the right answer to that kind of discourse. At the very least, I personally always try to, at least again across the series as collectively, show a representation of just how diverse humanity and whatever the species I'm talking about is. I also try to do that in a way that is appropriate and considerate. Is that the word I want to think of? I don't know. But obviously my point is I would never want to incorrectly write about a certain people in a way that they wouldn't appreciate. But again, so long as you feel that you are able to do this, and again, this is where talking to people of those kind of identities and backgrounds can come in helpful, because they can kind of give you an opinion of, is this okay, what you're doing? But if you can, again, you want to make sure that even in just a fictional standpoint, you are hearing as many types of voices as you can. And in terms of how that then comes about in a narrative, again, just at each juncture, if it's ever important, in terms of the important decisions that they are making, how they react to those sort of things, maybe one to consider. Have they come across anything like this before? How have they responded to that? How has knowledge of their previous reaction potentially going to shape their reaction in this case? That is not to say that you should force some kind of moment when it's like, oh, this person had an important memory involving a boat, therefore we have to make sure that suddenly out of nowhere there is something involving a boat in this book so they can have a callback to that personal experience. Now, that was a crude example. Before recording this video, I meant to not give an example because I knew it would be bad, but you get the point. Unless a story is very specifically being written to explore that identity, rather than, in my case, it's just happen of show off that there's more than one type of main character in a story. If you're specifically tailoring your story to tell that narrative, then sure. But if you're more like me and what I'm trying to do is more fact, be aware that these are the kind of characters you are writing, but they are then just any person that's taking a part in this adventure. In theory, when I'm writing my stories, it's like I could have any character fulfilling this kind of role in the story, and then I could just decide on a whim, what is their sex, what is their religion, whatever. Obviously, those things, as I've already been reiterating, do then have impacts on how that person would manifest in the story. The whole point here is that people aren't necessarily as interchangeable, but while subsequently, once you've made your decisions, you may find yourself just having to make some tweaks here and there about how certain interactions develop. On the whole, it should just be, this just could be any person who could have ended up being in this situation. They'll react how they do, but it's not ultimately important to the plot that they have insert element of identity here. Okay, so you've decided that you are going to go with that format. When you have you're working out your general story outline, you are just saying, okay, some character, whoever they end up being, will go on this path and we'll decide later. We can just go through for our different series and say, okay, we'll have some type of person here, some type of person here. That in turn, I say in turn a lot, that in turn potentially has a risk of just it being a token character, which again is not what we want. You don't want to just include it for the sake of including it. It's not a checklist to say, oh, I need to make sure I include the type of this person, this person, this person. Also, another thing I haven't mentioned up until this point, the are they able, are they disabled to some degree? That kind of thing as well. No, you don't want to necessarily be going through a checklist. It's finding a balance, right? You want to make sure that you are giving representation across your stories to these different groups within our society, but don't focus on it so much that then becomes the primary reason for being that thing. So what I have done at times, so not always, is kind of use a random number generator system, wherein for the different kind of characteristics aspects you can have to a person, so each time assign a possible specific thing it could be to different numbers or whatever, use a random number generator and just end up with a combination of different aspects, and that ends up being that person. Again, you could then afterwards consciously choose to alter that stuff if you want. You don't have to be completely victim to the whims of the machine. If you suddenly feel, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, the story may lend itself slightly more to this sort of thing. But for the most part, yeah, that's one way, at least, of ensuring that you are getting that kind of variety in there, but also it's not a manufactured, we're going to tick all of the boxes. It's perhaps potentially more reflective of the randomness of our multicultural societies. Again, referring to modern day Earth. If you're doing something historically, then obviously there's going to potentially be more societal, historical factors that will definitely determine things. And again, if you are doing something either in the future or different worlds, as both of which I am also doing, you do have slightly more leeway in terms of, you know, how you are saying the society is structured. And again, is there anything from their history, like there has been on Earth, that would affect things potentially? But because you have more freedom in that respect, again, unless it's specifically tied to the narrative of the story, that their society is structured in such a way that you're maybe more likely to have this type of person than this type of person, why not just have that more diverse cast populating that world? Alright, so then at that point you have your breakdown of this character's background and who they are and just a little description. That's going to, again, give you potentially a good starting point, because you can now, again, whether you know it from personal experience or you can do your research and finding out about such people, you can say, okay, this is probably the kind of person they're going to be. As already said before, it's not like one personality per identification. It's now still the finalising job to determine attitudes and so forth, just confirming what those are based upon the stimuli you have given yourself. At this point, I would say there are probably two other main things you want to consider. What's actually important to me when I'm coming up with my characters for these different situations is their job. Obviously, you know that this is the situation that is going on. It's more likely that a certain type of person may be involved, potentially, or maybe it is an open-ended thing, anyone could be involved. But even if it's more of like a general circumstance, what is it that they specifically do? What is their job? What is their function in this location? Have they had a previous function in the past? Are they looking to do a different thing instead, or at least at some point in the future? And again, if you know what people's jobs or at least roles are going to be, what do they do with their time, then that also inherently gives you relationships between the different characters, which obviously you can twist in whichever way you want, but it's all about starting points. The other one then is, if you know anything about Dungeons & Dragons, whether you play it or just heard about it, is I'm just going to take their alignment chart. The idea of having your lawful, neutral and chaotic and good, neutral and evil. You can argue there is going to be more nuance to it than that, but it can help say, okay, this is an evil character, but are they following some kind of rule, some kind of code? Are they potentially trying to literally follow the book, as it were, or at the very least, you know, have some standard they're going by, they're trying to uphold something? Or are they purely chaotic? I wanted to use a different word there but couldn't think of one quick enough. And even if you have those as their intentions, how do they go about it? And again, once you know how they would typically go about something, that can help guide you to say, okay, in this situation they would respond in a sort of way, or they would think of this character in this way. Their opinion of this thing would change given this stimulus. All of this has been rather clinical, I guess, whatever. I'm struggling to think of certain words today. In the end, you're going through a very scientific method of this is how we are going to determine what this person is like. A lot of times, though, this, with the exception of doing the research about certain background things, a lot of this can then just happen subconsciously. Just as you are writing the character, it just naturally starts to develop in certain ways, with you just also then having those conscious checks of just making sure this is consistently this person rather than just a reflection of myself. This is not invalidating anything that I've just been saying. It's not saying that, oh, regardless of everything I just said, you can just sit down, not make any conscious decisions, and just see what happens. But I say sometimes when I'm talking about my writing, when people talk about, how I have been asked once, how do you develop your characters? Or what is your inspiration? How do you come up with the stories? It isn't necessarily something that you are consciously coming up with. It's just as your mind is just generally considering this nebulous plot that you were thinking about, you just suddenly find yourself already being aware that these are the details. Just when you're thinking about the person going through this experience, it all just occurs to you, well, yes, they will have X, Y, Z about them. That may then mean that you need to go backwards to anything you were thinking about earlier to add that kind of setup in. But yeah, it's, as with any kind of writing, it is, say, the balance between how much you've planned beforehand and then just allowing the story to overtake you as you're going, just taking your mindful steps. Maybe you wouldn't mind if, when going through that kind of subconscious process of them naturally evolving over writing, that you wouldn't mind that it becomes a reflection of yourself. Some people maybe specifically do want characters to be allegories of themselves or their own experiences. But again, just what I'm trying to talk about today, which, yes, has kind of been a bit rambly, kind of all over the place. This is not as much of a structured video as others in the past have been, as you may be able to tell as you're going through. If you are doing multiple stories, either knowing that you're going into that from the beginning, or rather just, as most creatives will probably do, is just they don't only do one project in their entire life, they just have to do something else unrelated afterwards. Again, if you want to make sure that you're making your characters as distinctive as your stories were, as anything else that goes into them, again, just some other things to bear in mind. Again, not a checklist, just as how it's not a checklist to make sure you cover everything, but it is just something where if you are looking across doing multiple characters, especially ones that the reader is going to be spending a lot of time with, just thinking, is this the same as the kind of person that I've done before? What other kind of person could instead, feasibly and realistically, also be in this kind of circumstance? To save myself from perhaps being any more cyclical even further, I'm probably just going to draw a halt to that for today. Hopefully you found that interesting. If you are doing any kind of creative storytelling of your own, it doesn't have to be prose, it could be anything that has a character in it, any of those kind of, again, I don't know if I call them tips. This is kind of meant to be a tip video, or at least discussing the philosophy of creating a protagonist. But if that's given you food for thought, it's probably the best way of thinking about it. Next week we will be back to the more typical descriptions and breakdowns of the lore of the Ragnarok Chronicles themselves. So again, just make sure to check out that. Otherwise, again, I hope you found this interesting. And until I see you again, just remember to keep on telling stories.